Hello, everyone. That phrase that history repeats itself, which, yeah, we've all been maybe feeling that lately. It is true on both a micro and a macro level, and it always has to do with blind spots. So I want to spend some time talking about that today. So let's talk about that a little bit. The truth is that history does repeat itself. And the reason why that has a tendency to happen is because of the blind spots that we have developed, oftentimes in childhood, most of the time in childhood. Very good for us to bring awareness to first of all, just the fact that we have blind spots, right? Is a very good starting point. Just being able to acknowledge I probably have some blind spots in my awareness that it would be good if I started to see where they are. That in and of itself is huge, right? So being able to just acknowledge that the blind spots may be there, because that already is stepping outside of that controller who says, I don't have any blind spots, everything is fine, and letting ourselves acknowledge that maybe something's there. And then, of course, the next step is then going into what they might be. And as we find these blind spots, as we see these blind spots, they're already going to start to shift. And they're going to shift patterns in our lives, patterns that we have probably hated for a really long time, to be honest. So when we understand our past with clarity, okay, to understand our past with clarity means that we have to release our dissociation that is stopping us from understanding our past with clarity. And that's when the blind spots leave and the patterns stop repeating themselves. And this is ultimately, believe it or not, even though we may not know it, what we all want. In the end, this is what we all want. It is one of the hardest things to do. And I'll tell you why. Because in order to stop our blind spots, we have to feel the emotions that are tied to those old patterns. And not only that, we don't just have to feel the emotions tied to the old patterns, we have to feel the emotions associated with wasting our time in those patterns. So there's like a grief. Sometimes I refer to it as a grieving time. This is like, if I change, I then have to acknowledge that the way I was doing it before was not good, and I spent a lot of time there, and that feels like a lot of wasted time, right? So our defenders are not going to want to do any of that, which you probably already guessed. The controller is sort of the king of the blind spots, and the idea of changing that is very, very threatening to that controller for the reasons that I just explained here, right? So they want us to stay in the dark. They want us to try to find another way of addressing these patterns other than feeling these feelings. And most of the time, they're looking for an external solution. And all of the time, they're not going to find it, okay? I'm here to tell you, you cannot change a traumatic pattern in your current life, right, by changing something external. It isn't going to work. The internal has to shift, unfortunately. Believe me, I say unfortunately because I've seriously tried. I tried to find another way. Who wants to do this, right? I really did put in all the effort to find a way to fix my patterns without feeling this stuff. I mean, okay, when I say I mean my controller did, right? Because that is truly what happened. So we want to figure out how to see these blind spots, right? We want to track them down here. So I have 4 things we can look for. Those 4 things right now with you. The first one is if a thought or a belief feels like it is undeniably true. Okay. And it has always been true. And when I say that, I mean, there's like a level of adamancy to this that feels maybe a little intense. It is time to question that thought or belief. Are we going to do that all the time? No, we're not. We're going to hold on. And that's what controllers do. They hold on. Now, I also want to say, without a doubt, that our parts are evidence-based. I never ever question that a belief that's coming up from a part wasn't based on a reality at one time. Okay. Now, sometimes that reality is this was consistently happening to me again and again and again. That's the evidence. Another thing is we were consistently being told something again and again and again. Now, that thing might have been a blatant lie, and a lot of times it is, especially if it's coming from like the karmic and shame. So these parts are very, very evidence-based in our system. We don't want to deny that to them when we go through the process of questioning them. As a matter of fact, unless it is a shame-based belief, which is truly a lie from the very beginning, for example, it's all my fault, that's a shame-based belief. Most of the time, it's best to say, yes, I believe that at one time that was very true, right? That doesn't mean it has to be true. Now, there are always exceptions to everything. But just getting that question out there is remarkable. It's such a big deal to do that. Because the truth is, most of the evidence that our parts have gathered was gathered from a very small segment of the overall population, if we're going to speak in statistical terms. And yes, I can get sciencey like that sometimes. And then it is projected out into the rest of the world, right? So it's evidence-based, but its particular sample size is super small, generally speaking. I mean, even if you experience trauma from every single person in your family, and even some people who maybe were friends of the family or contacts of the family, it's still a very small portion of society, okay? Again, I'm not saying we need to put on rose-colored glasses and act like everybody's so much better than our family either. That isn't necessarily the answer. But being able to ask some really basic questions of ourselves is a big deal. One of the things I did when I started, actually, I did something I call a trust rewire. And it was one of those times when I really was examining my trust beliefs and I was asking myself a lot, is this true? And I started to do this thing where I looked for evidence or examples where I was wrong. And I'll be honest, I had a ton of resistance in my system to doing this, okay? It was not small. My system was like, all you're going to find is exactly what you already know. Like, they were sure, my parts were sure that's what I was going to find. But you know what? I didn't. I think the universe actually knew what I was doing, and the universe can get really chatty when we're paying attention. And I had several big experiences where I watched myself think one thing and I watched something entirely different happen during that. One of them was, like, I'll just give you an example. I was driving into a parking lot and this guy drove in right in front of me. And this parking lot is usually really busy. On this day, it was super busy. It wasn't a lot, it was a garage. And when he drove in, I'm like, he's going to take the only space. Like, he's going to take it. And it was like the universe was just dying to prove me wrong. And this guy drove into the lot, drove past the spot that was open and waved me into it. Now, has that happened to me ever before or since then? I don't think so. I don't remember. But I will say that in that moment, I know that I was being sent a really powerful message about don't always believe what you think. So that was really interesting. Carol is saying, could an example of a blind spot be being told that you are crazy by your abusers? It can be. Like, I think that the blind spot part of it is actually when new people tell you you're crazy and you make excuses for them, which actually we're going to talk about making excuses. So it's like it's not that you don't know that they're calling you crazy or you don't know that your family called you crazy. It's that you kind of make it all right? Because it's so historical, like, well, the evidence says, like, they all said I'm crazy, so maybe I am right. That's the message in that. And so, yeah, what happens, the blind spot for us is that when other people also call us crazy, we go, what? Yeah. As opposed to, like, what I would do if somebody called me crazy now, just, like, kick them out of my life forever. That is not what we do, because we have a blind spot to the significant problem with that treatment, right? So that's the blind spot. So yes, in a way, it's not that you don't see it, but it's that you don't see it as a problem. That's the blind spot, right? Now, in some cases, we don't see it. We literally dissociate from it. But in that particular example, because you're conscious of it, the blind spot is the excuses that we make for them. So it's a good example. Thank you, Carol. So the next one I want to talk about is that, like, for example, if we have a really incredibly frustrating pattern, we do need to look at what we can do to change it. Okay. Now, some people are immediately going to start going, oh my God, that's victim blaming. It's not our fault. No, it's not our fault that we're in a pattern. It's not. Okay. Most patterns in the world did come from each individual person experienced trauma, and then that trauma manifested in the world in both very micro ways and very macro ways. Okay. There are, and I'm going to talk about that right now. If a pattern is macro enough, for example, is systemic enough, we probably can't change the pattern itself. I mean, there are plenty of people who've gone out and done their best with this, some people that I admire tremendously. But what we can do is interact with it differently. That's usually the place where we can bring in change, okay? We are not going to stop racism, right? We are not going to stop misogyny by ourselves. But it becomes about the way in which we interact with those macro patterns that are extremely infuriating. But no, we're not going to stop the pattern itself. So sometimes that's true. If others are too committed to the pattern, okay, we may only be able to stop the pattern by removing ourselves from the pattern entirely, which might mean removing ourselves from the person. It may be possible to set boundaries and continue a relationship with that person who's very committed to the pattern if they are willing to respect the boundary. But in some cases, changing the pattern means walking away from someone who is extremely committed to the pattern, right? But in some cases, we can change our response and others will shift with us, or they will interact with us differently. A lot of that is unconscious. Like, they change because the pattern they were trying to create isn't working, and they don't really even recognize consciously that that's happening. But in some cases, they consciously see it and they realize it's not a good pattern and they change with you. What can happen, I've seen both in my life and working with my clients, but the goal is to stop it, right? The goal is to stop the pattern. Keep the pattern from continuing to be a part of your life. That's where we're going. Whether that means we can stop just our interactions with the pattern, or we can change just our interactions with the pattern, or we can, in fact, stop that person from doing those things. But that's a really important, what we don't want to believe, this is really hard not to believe, we don't want to believe the karma kid when they start telling us there's absolutely nothing we can do. Okay. The karma kid, again, is going to come at you with a lot of evidence that says, yeah, I'm right. And that's really challenging to believe something else when they are coming at us with that. But we want to keep questioning. We want to keep doing what we can to throw out those questions, to keep us considering how we can interact with the pattern differently. Okay. So that's number 2. Number 3, and this is going back to kind of the one Carol was talking about here. If we are constantly making excuses or ignoring important red flags, okay, so someone's calling you crazy, like you were talking about, it is important to ask ourselves why. Like, why are we accepting? Why are we tolerating certain behaviors? What is it about that? Now, obviously, there are parts coming up and saying, well, like 25 people have said this to you, so it must be true, right? Again, very small sample size. But that's what they're telling you, right? One of the biggest reasons for pattern repetition is that we are tolerating behaviors in adulthood that we had to tolerate in childhood, right? And so this is where that blind spot thing comes in really, really heavy, because as children, we couldn't get away. We couldn't get away from the patterns. We couldn't get away from the people. We couldn't get away from what they were doing. So in order to tolerate it, in order to cope with it without falling into like pure despair and not functioning anymore, was to pretend it was fine or forget it altogether. So what are the red flags that you are explaining away, right? Like, what are the things that you're going, it's okay. Like, it's okay. Maybe that person didn't mean it, or that person didn't realize what they said, or it's not that bad to be told that. Maybe I'm overreacting, which is a huge one we often heard as kids, right? My response is the problem, not what's happening, right? That's a huge thing that most of us have heard as a message at one time or another. So we want to investigate why. Why are we explaining away the red flag? Why are we tolerating certain behaviors? And then a big question, and this leads me into the fourth thing I want to talk about today, is what are you afraid will happen if you stop tolerating it? Because I guarantee you're very afraid of what's going to happen when you stop tolerating it. Now, again, you might not be aware that you are as afraid as you are. Most of the time, these feelings run very deep and they're very old. They go all the way back to childhood when we had to tolerate things to stay alive. And you might be thinking, what? What does life or death have to do with this? Everything. Because when you had a parent who was doing something you had to tolerate, the reason you had to tolerate it was because you might, in a lot of cases, have been under the impression that not tolerating it meant you were gonna die. Okay? Because not tolerating it meant the parent wasn't going to provide your basic needs for you anymore. And I hate to say it, but an 8-year-old cannot survive in this world without a caretaker. That is impossible. So we needed that person. This fear can be quite intense, and it can be very life or death, right? So the number 4 is, if the fear comes up when we consider making a change to a pattern or a belief and understanding, we need to take it very seriously. We can't kind of blow it off and be like, oh, that doesn't make sense, or that's silly, or that's just childhood nonsense. Okay, like that's the stuff the controller will say. But all of that is actually really, really important. So we want to write from that fear. We want to let the fear come out. And you may be surprised how intense and how deep it runs in your system when you really start to explore in a compassionate way the fear related to changing a pattern. It's why we don't. It's why we sit in these patterns that we hate. Like, we can be so mad, so frustrated. We can spend so much of our energy trying to externally find a fix, right? All because this fear is there that says if you change this pattern, you're not going to make it out alive. Again, yes, is that wrong? Of course, it's wrong. But it doesn't make it less there. Like, we can have an understanding here and say, well, that's silly, or whatever it is we're telling ourselves, it invalidates. It's like, logically, that's not a thing. Okay, but under the surface, it's still there, and it will continue to drive your decision making. It will continue to drive the way you avoid changing patterns. So this is why it's so critical for us to work with that fear, right from that fear, hear it out, no matter how kind of tempted we might be to tell ourselves that's silly, or that's dumb, or that's ridiculous, or this is a waste of my time. All of these things are things that come from defensive parts in our system. Let yourself explore that fear and write from that fear. It will help you. Sometimes I refer to this as resistance writing. Right? So let's say you want to set a boundary and all you hear is, oh my God, you can't do it. They'll hate you forever. They'll abandon you. Again, we're getting back to those early childhood fears. That's the resistance we want to work with, right? So let that fear write, because it's there and it's important. And if you don't acknowledge it, it doesn't leave. And that's true of every single emotion in our system. If it isn't heard, it doesn't leave. So, and the truth is, unlike what I think is the more kind of mainstream popular view, thoughts have almost zero manifestation ability in our lives. And I'm talking about conscious thoughts. Unconscious emotions and unconscious thoughts have almost all of the manifestation abilities in our lives. So if we ignore the unconscious by focusing on our logical understanding of the world, we will not see significant change happen in our lives. Unfortunately, the truth. Believe me, I've been trying to figure it out in my mind for a very long time. I definitely wanted to take that path much more than this one. Obviously, I'm very glad I'm on this one now. But I didn't wanna, and I don't think any of us wanna. But this is the way we change the pattern. So that is what I have for you today. Thank you all for being here. So thank you all for coming and being with me today. I really appreciate it very much. And let me know if you have any other comments or thoughts or questions around this concept of blind spots. I'd love to hear it either here or on the sharing that I did earlier, the meme and the words that I wrote. Feel free to engage with me on that concept if you're still like, wait, what? It's not easy to see. That's why we call it a blind spot. But I'm here. I look forward to talking to you guys next week. And next week on Tuesday at noon, we will discuss another trauma topic. Thank you all so much. And I'll talk to you soon. Bye.